Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Scots Way podcast. And I'm joined once again by writer and journalist Graeme Thomson. Hello, Graeme.
Hi, Ali. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. And we're going to talk, first of all, about Under the Ivy, your biography of Kate Bush, and Small Hours, which is about John Martyn, but I'm sure we'll talk about a whole lot more. Graeme, I thought just to give people some background, as well as a journalist who writes for a number of publications, you've written quite a few biographies. Could you maybe take us through your back catalogue, so to speak?
Yeah, I was kind of horrified to realise it's been 20 years now since the first book I wrote, which is scary numbers. Yeah, so Elvis Costello was the first book I wrote in 2004 for Canongate. And yeah, and then I think there's been 9 or 10 now. Interestingly, I think the early books reflected my interest in kind of Americana and country music. There's books on Johnny Cash and Willie Nelson, which maybe reflected my kind of passions at the time in terms of music, which are probably not quite as strong as nowadays as they were then. So writing about Willie Nelson was fascinating because he's kind of it's a great American life, and I was lucky enough to go up to Texas for 2 or 3 weeks and sort of meet his entourage and meet him eventually as well. And then Kate Bush, which the book we're going to talk about partly now, first came out in 2010. That was I think it was my third or fourth book. But because she has done various things since then, it's been updated and revised. I've done a book on George Harrison, which was a really kind of exciting, an interesting project, because that's someone who, although probably everybody in the world knows who he is or knew who he was, I felt he was still kind of slightly unknown as a human being or as an individual, within the context of the biggest band in the world. So that was a really interesting project. And then latterly, I've written books about Phil Lynott, of Thin Lizzy, and Simple Minds, which is a real kind of passion project for me. And as you said, John Martyn came in between those two. So it's a real kind of patchwork of different artists and sensibilities and sounds. And yeah, 20 years later, here we are.
So it's interesting, you were writing about Willie Nelson and Johnny Cash, and it made me think that people who are a success in this country, Elvis Costello is a good example, Kate Bush another great example. I mean, it's a different level in America, isn't it? Willie Nelson is an absolute icon to a huge country.
Totally. I mean, it's funny because actually I was talking to someone about this recently who said, oh, he's kind of really underappreciated over here now. Like, you don't hear much about Willie Nelson. He hasn't been, I suppose, in some ways commodified in the way that Johnny Cash was towards the end of his life, where he became this very hip figure, this kind of Glastonbury cool. And it did kind of happen with Willie maybe 10, 15 years ago. He played Glastonbury, but he's maybe lived too long. You know what I mean? There hasn't been the full stop with Willie. He's just kept going and kept making records. And so, artists have this sort of point where you can everyone kind of feels that they're hip, and death unfortunately does help with that. And Willie, thank God, has kept going. In America, I think it's a very different thing. He is part of the landscape there. He's part of the kind of Mount Rushmore of musical icons, I think.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I can imagine a musical Mount Rushmore with Cash and Nelson being two of the prominent heads. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think maybe over there they have an appreciation of him as a songwriter as well. That incredible canon of songs that he's written for so many different people, as well as his own material. Going right back to Patsy Cline, he does connect so many eras of music and so many different styles of music, I think. And when he is gone, there will be no one there to replace him. There's nobody like him. He's kind of the last living link, I think, to something quite special and extraordinary in American music. And maybe it takes being an American or being in America to really understand what that represents.
And actually, it's an interesting into Under the Ivy. I've got it here, the life and music of Kate Bush, because there's someone who has been around for a while, and we think of them now as a national treasure. I think we think of Kate, that especially with kind of recent revival. But there were times where it wasn't just that she wasn't appreciated; she was kind of derided, or at least made fun of. which is incredible to think of now.
Yeah, I mean, there's no almost about it. She was very widely derided and ridiculed and parodied and pastiched, and was a figure of fun, certainly in those early years. You know, you think of the Pamela Stephenson sketches. People of a certain age will remember that, not 9 o'clock news. And like a lot of great artists, she's very easy to take the piss out of and to parody. It's just because what is there is so incredibly kind of unique and striking. And yeah, I mean, if I went back, obviously, when I wrote the book originally, went back through all the interviews and coverage, and the majority of it was probably negative in the first 2 or 3 years at least, or slightly superior or mocking, or, you know, all those terms, or just a bit patronizing. She was kind of peddled as this posh girl, really, who had these artistic aspirations and pretensions. And I don't think it wasn't really till The Hounds of Love in 1985, I think, that you started to see a consensus amongst, certainly amongst the music critics, that this was someone who actually was doing something quite extraordinary. And as you said, you know, that terrible phrase, national treasure, which I always kind of think really smooths out so many of the interesting parts of an artist's life and journey and career. And
I think it does, yeah, absolutely. It's almost like, well, that's the box that you put them in and don't ask any questions about what's going on.
Yeah, and it's happened to David Bowie. It's like, David Bowie, he's amazing, he's great. And it's like, well, yeah, of course he was great, but he also did some really, really ropey work. And he could do some really odd and amusing things, and he could be very silly. And I think being silly is a very important part of an artist's bravery, really. Their courage to do stuff that makes them look exposed or vulnerable or daft should be celebrated, actually. And so, you know, I hope people reading the book will see that it wasn't always just, God, she's amazing, and God, she's an icon and she's a genius. There have been times where she's made missteps, and times certainly when she has not been recognized as the kind of figure that she is now.
I'd never considered that, but you're absolutely right. Some of the great music stars, Prince, Bowie, Kate Bush, have been willing to kind of poke a bit of fun at themselves. You know, have been that time. And also, I can remember in the kind of round about the Glass Spider tour when he was really kind of, as you say, ridiculed himself. It's like, what is this? And what's going on here?
Oh, I remember reading reviews, people just going, "Please stop, David. Please stop. You're ruining your legacy." You know, in the late 80s, early 90s, he was a figure of fun as much as, and it slightly annoys me. It doesn't annoy me, but I just find it makes things less interesting when that's kind of forgotten about. And it's like, oh, we always loved David Bowie. Well, no, anyone who's making music for that length of time is going to go through those stages where people are sick of them, or they're not, you know, firing on all cylinders. And it's kind of remiss not to remember that, I think. Excuse me.
The early years of Kate Bush is really interesting, partly in the way that she was treated by the press, not just the music press, the press in general, who there was always this underlying thing that, well, there's Machiavellian men behind this phenomenon that was Kate Bush. And it's really interesting to now go back and read that, you know, that, oh yeah, well, Dave Gilmour wrote everything, or, you know, the guys in the band, or and do you think that that affected her kind of relationship with the press, which was a complex one?
Yeah, because she became sort of tabloidized straight away. You know, she had this #1 with Wuthering Heights, first single, and because, of course, she sang in that extraordinary manner, and because her videos were very theatrical, and so she became a kind of tabloid phenomenon straight away, which I don't think, well, I know it wasn't in the script. You know, I think both her and EMI saw her as an album artist, a slow burn. You know, you have to take time to kind of get into your career, and of course that didn't happen. And yeah, the amount of sexism and you know, objectification and just sort of male superiority that you read in those early interviews is quite eye-opening, and not just in the tabloids, in the music press too. That this little pampered girl couldn't possibly be coming up with these songs, or couldn't really be in control of what she was doing. yeah, to quite an astounding degree, that kind of was the script. I think it did affect her. I think just the sheer impact of being famous straight away. I think if we're looking at how Kate Bush has since conducted her career and indeed her life in the way that she's tried to protect a lot of things about herself, I think those first 2 years are probably really instructive to kind of give us a clue about, well, she was thrust into this arena, this bear pit of fame and objectification, and really spent 40 years trying to negotiate her way out of that, and also to keep control of what she was doing musically. And I can't think of many artists who were as successful as she was doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Under the Ivy has been remastered by Omnibus, the publisher. Was that off the back of the Stranger Things revival and interest, or was it always going to happen?
I'm not really sure. I don't, it's part of there's 4 books coming out, of which this is one in the first part of this remastered series, and I think there'll be more. I don't think, certainly the impetus wasn't to update it or revise it. It was just to give it a new lease of life, really, put out there. And imagining that yes, the boost in her profile that came through Stranger Things and being in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame probably helped that. But it was put to me that we're going to reissue this, and I actually just said, look, it's been 10 years, and although there hasn't been an enormous amount of activity by her, things have still happened in her world that are interesting. So, can I just kind of update it? So the impetus wasn't to kind of revise it. It was to put it out first. And then I just thought, well, let's make it, for people who are coming to Kate Bush for the first time, let's make it a more complete picture of, the whole life up till now.
Because there will be people who discovered her through Stranger Things who will want to know, because that was an extraordinary kind of success.
Yeah, and such a kind of contemporary way of an artist getting, a boost in their career, and that you don't really have to do anything anymore. Although her saying yes, which is quite a big thing in her world, her allowing her music to be made, to be used and put into that show, was quite an active decision on her part. But yeah, I mean, certainly in America, hugely it has made her, given her the kind of profile that she hasn't had before. She's very much, or was before that, very much a kind of cult indie artist in America. People who knew, but she certainly wasn't a mainstream. So it's been really nice to see that. And I think also with, like my kids' demographic, late teens, mid-teens even, kind of discovering her music and realizing that she is a very important link in the chain to maybe some of the artists that they love now, kind of seeing connections. That's been a really nice thing to see as well.
So back in 2010, did you say when it was first published, why did you want to write about Kate Bush? Why was that someone that was of interest to you?
I felt, it's always there's a kind of mix of like personal and professional and practical reasons. I thought, I was a fan. I wasn't like an obsessive fan. I wouldn't have had all her records, but I've always listened to her and loved a lot of her work. And as as an avid reader of music books and someone who was, writing about music by that point, I was aware there wasn't really a definitive book about her, and that felt like a bit of a gap in the market. And just her, I just felt there was so much of interest in this person who we don't really know, having such an incredibly strong place in our culture and such a strong image. Everything about her is so kind of unique. And yet she's managed to sort of project that behind this veneer of being a very kind of private and normal person. And I thought that was a really fascinating thing to try and write about. And not really to, not to puncture that mystery completely. I didn't want to delve too deeply into, the personal stuff. It was more just connecting the dots and, and finding, the idea is always to enrich the reader, when you're reading it, to think, okay, that album or that movie or that tour kind of comes to life a bit more for having known that or having read that. And I thought with Kate Bush there was maybe a lack of literature out there that sort of did that or served that purpose.
What I really enjoy about your biographies that I've read is that it sends the reader to the music. You know, I think if reading Under the Ivy, if you hadn't listened to The Dreaming, for instance, which has got a kind of a reputation as a difficult album in inverted commas, I think you would then go, oh, because you put it in context, what was going on around it and what our thoughts are, you went, oh yeah, I'm going to listen to that now because I've got kind of greater understanding. Is that something that you really want to do, is to kind of, you know, make sure the music is kind of front and center with some perhaps explanation around it?
Yeah, I think the music always has to be the kind of driving force of it, because if there's no substance to the music, or I'm not really interested in it, or it doesn't enliven me, then I don't see an awful lot of point in spending 2 years writing about somebody, no matter how interesting their life might be. And, you know, when I'm writing stuff, and, you know, I was thinking about this when I was writing about Simple Minds, and it's the same with Kate Bush. It's a weird act of sort of transportation where you were actually there when you're writing it. You're very kind of vividly aware of the environment that the person's in, and you start to feel like you're kind of in that moment. It's a bit like time travel, you know, and so you're kind of seeing it, and as best you can trying to convey that to the reader, and to put it in context, and also to put, like, The Dreaming is a really good example because it's a really dark record, and we have, I think, maybe a tendency to think of Kate Bush as someone who's quite a light, sort of happy, upbeat, privileged person, and I think more than cursory listen to the music will disabuse people of that notion. You know, there's a lot of very kind of naughty stuff going on, naughty with a K, stuff going on in psychologically in her work, and particularly that record, where I think she's working through a lot of things to do with being famous and being unhappy and being psychologically kind of under attack. So you'd hope that pulling out those strands in the music and telling people what's going on in her life at that time, you suddenly get a much clearer idea of what's going on and what's the impetus for her to create.
And I think actually that darkness, or at least the kind of something not quite right, was not quite right. That's the wrong way of putting it. Yeah. In the songs from the beginning, it was there, you know, a song even like The Man with the Child in Her Eyes, you're like that, well, you know, this is a strange song. It's a strange lyric for someone who was very young when they wrote it to be doing. And then you've got things like Babushka and Army Dreamers that, you know, are dealing with some really complicated subjects. So there, if you only knew the image and you didn't really knew the music, you hadn't spent time. Yeah, that's what I love particularly about, is the complexity of not just the music, but the lyrics and the whole thing. The whole, you know, she really thinks about the whole, the way it's presented. You've spoken about the dance, the videos, all of those things. Yeah, she seems to have real control. It's interesting looking back that people thought, well, she's under the control of others, when in fact, right from the beginning, she kind of demanded to be in control.
Totally, yeah. I mean, you know, that the choice of single, Wuthering Heights, she put her foot down with EMI and said, "This is the song I want to announce me to the world," as it were. And she got her way, and I think that's very true. You know, it's interesting. You know, we talk now about someone like Taylor Swift, who has this incredible kind of overview of everything in her career and very in control of it. And you know, Kate Bush was doing that 40 odd years ago. I mean, and being very strategic about joining the dots between the image and the songs and the words and you know, the packaging, the artwork, everything. It was an incredible kind of tapestry of her vision for what she was trying to do. And I say in the book, you know, to almost to see her as a pop star is to go on the wrong tangent. I think, you know, she's a writer and she's a auteur, she's a kind of director. It's very filmic. And it's not always autobiographical. Quite often it is just about taking stimulus from films or from stories, but conveying that in an incredibly kind of personal and meaningful way, because it obviously means a lot to her, these subjects. And I was amazed how rooted that stuff is in her childhood, you know, and the stimulus she got from her older brothers and her family, and everything from Irish folk music to you know, pre-Raphaelite writing and poetry. And there's a huge kind of library of different influences that she could draw from in her early years. That you really, once you know that, and then you listen to the music, it does kind of make sense where a lot of her influences come from.
And I just, as an aside, also a big comedy fan, it seems.
Mm.
You know, so that idea of understanding even when people were perhaps taking the mick, you know, part of a British comedy a history that she was familiar with.
And I think there are elements in her work that we are supposed to laugh at. You know, I don't. It's a shame it can get a bit po-faced sometimes around Kate Bush, because some of it is intentionally quite funny and silly, I think. And actually, interestingly, you know, the shows she did in 2014 before the dawn, you know, the bits that didn't work were the bits where she was trying to tap into kind of Blackadder and that sort of British sort of satirical wordplay comedy, which she clearly loves, but I'm not sure is top of the list of her strengths creatively. And so there was these slight kind of longers in the show where it didn't quite hit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And she's as you've kind of hinted at, a notoriously private person. Was it difficult to get interviews and quotes for the book? Were people reticent?
It was much less difficult than I kind of feared or thought, actually. You know, it was when I proposed this book, there were quite a few publishers who were like, well, we'd love to do this, but it's not gonna, it won't happen. You know, it's not going to be, either she will be too obstructive, or no one will talk to you, or it'll get litigious or whatever. And I didn't feel that was a bit defeatist, really. And I was very surprised at the amount of people who did talk. I knew she wouldn't talk to me. I was under no illusions that she would sort of sit down for a long chat. That was fine. I knew there were certain people very close to her who it was very unlikely would speak to me. Outside of that, I think my strike rate was really pretty high. And I think it maybe helped. I had a few books under my belt, and was also able to kind of explain, hopefully, that I was trying to write about her art and her music, and not really, you know, I didn't want to delve too much into her own life, although that, of course, is relevant. So yeah, it was. I mean, there were some sticky moments. There was the odd sort of email and things about stuff, but actually, in general, I was pleasantly surprised how accommodating people were, because one of the great things about Kate Bush is that most people really loved working with her and had nothing but good things to say, which sometimes is a bit, you know, as a biographer, you want a bit of light and shade, but there was a huge amount of positive feedback from people who worked with her, very few dissenting voices. So no, it was a very pleasant book to write, and a very, as I was saying earlier, a very pleasant place to spend my time, you know, going back to these kind of idyllic farmhouses in the late 70s, and these barns and beautiful bohemian domestic setups and stuff. It was quite enchanting, actually.
Yeah, because what we're going to say, at that time, that the kind of early formative years, you can almost, and it's the same actually when we come on to talk about John Martyn, that you can get the seeds of the story that's about to be told in those early childhood years, can't you? Is that something you found for all the subjects that you've been writing about?
I think so. I mean, very strongly with her, I think, and John Martyn, and Phil Lynott too. I think three people who you can really trace a lot of their, you know, personality traits and decision making and drive from their early days. And with Kate Bush, I wanted to establish that physical and sort of psychological space where she inhabited as a kid, really strongly, because I felt I could keep going back there as her career went on, because I felt she does keep drawing from that right the way through her career, and not just in terms of music, but also in how she wants to live her life. She's quite unusual, I guess, in an artist, in that she had nothing to kick against. You know, there was no struggle on the surface. There was no revolution. There was no trying to upend the status quo. She had a very privileged and comfortable background. And I suppose it was instructive to kind of look at, well, how does an artist actually use that in a really positive way when you feel you don't have that? impetus of trying to fight something. How do you use all the positives in your life to create? And I think setting up her sort of domestic setup as a kid was a really good way of showing how that can be done. You know, with someone like Phil Lynott, it's a whole different thing. It's just a whole terrible kind of mess of identity crisis and not really knowing who your family are and where you belong, and the insecurities that come with that. And well, we'll talk about John surely in a minute.
We will. But maybe this is a good way into talking about John Martyn. But Kate Bush's school life is interesting because she's not really standout or extraordinary. In fact, a lot of people kind of overlook her. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, she's sort of characterized by the people I spoke to who were friends of hers. Just a nice, quiet girl. You know, smart, talented. Played a bit of violin, but nobody really knew. In fact, you know, the stories of them hearing her on the radio singing Wuthering Heights and going, "That's Catherine from school." And they're like, "No, it can't be." Yeah, it is. She didn't tell anybody, and you know, she was making throughout that period. She was making demos with Dave Gilmour. She was going in and playing with Jeff Emerick, who worked with the Beatles. She was recording with orchestras. Nobody knew. And again, if you look now at how she lives her life and how she makes her work, it's the same thing, isn't it? You know, she's not telling everyone what she's about to do, or she's not looking for huge amounts of kudos or on social media. She just goes and does it, and then we find out about it when she's ready to hear it. And so I thought that was really interesting. So no, she's not. There's this very, very strong, quiet determination in her from a very early age that she kind of knows what she wants. It is slightly revolutionary, but in that very quiet way of, I'm not going to upset anyone. I'm just going to do what I want to do.
Yeah, because never ruthless, as you mentioned earlier. Everyone, was there one example where someone thought that they should have been given kind of credit for something, and then when she discovered that that person thought that, she was very keen to kind of put that right?
Yeah, I think a check was sent in the post. Yeah, it was a band called Unicorn who played with her very early on, I think, on some demos, and she eventually put that much later put it out as a B-side or something like that. And they said in an interview, "Oh well, it would have been nice to have been credited." And you know, she wrote a check and sent it off. And I mean, there are a couple of dissenting voices. There was Charlie Morgan, who was a drummer in the early days, and he remembers her playing all these new songs, and everyone in the family and in the band going, yeah, "That's amazing, that's amazing, it's amazing." And he went, "I'm not sure that one's all that good." And there's a kind of deathly silence in the room, like you don't say that to Kate. So I thought that was quite revealing, is that there was this kind of industry around her that was constantly buoying her up and supporting her, you know, in a very non sort of dramatic way, but it was like, you know, we are here to do the best for Kate, and that included her brothers and her family and her bandmates, and but no ruthlessness, no. But there was I suppose there is, and there has to be that idea that yeah, she is the center of that world, and that everything has to be done to support her.
I can't think of many, if any, other musicians who are so fated and thought of as artistic geniuses, whose determination to keep their domestic life, if you like, so normal. And you know, that seems to be what she's managed to do.
Well, she definitely has. I mean, I don't actually know. I'm not really sure how one manages to do that to that extent. Because you know, she does go out and do stuff, and she does. You know, when her son was of school age, she was on the school run and in the playground, and I don't quite know how she's managed to pull off that trick of being really completely invisible to the public for years and years and years and years. Indeed, you know, her son was born and nobody knew about it for 2 years. That's quite a trick, and there must be quite a lot of, you know, the swan analogy. Must be quite a lot of frantic paddling underwater to make sure that happens. You know, I know there are a few NDAs flying around and stuff like that, but I think it also speaks to the fact that she has a very trusted and loyal group of friends and people who take her happiness quite seriously, and she has managed to extricate herself from that sort of tabloid world. I mean, every time she sort of does something, there's usually a kind of a rehash of something in the Daily Mail or something about the Miss Havisham on the Hill or whatever. But I think that has lessened a lot, and it's really useful, I think, for us, because it does mean we can. I think it has helped us start to really appreciate the music and the creativity, and not get so bogged down in this idea of this mad recluse. And actually, you know, I think it is gendered, that kind of idea of someone who disappears for a long time. I was thinking about someone like Tom Waits. We haven't seen Tom Waits for 10 years. He hasn't made a record. We're not frantically wondering what he's up to, or he's gone mad, or living in a mansion. And, you know, he probably is living in a Gothic mansion somewhere in the woods, you know. But, you know, and Roddy Frame, I was thinking, Roddy Frame wasn't, you know, done anything for 10 years. But we're not fetishizing him as some kind of mad recluse. It's just people are living their lives. And increasingly now with the music industry, I think the impetus to put out albums and stuff is not as strong as it used to be. So I hope the book clarifies some of that sort of language around her. But I think just the air has cleared anyway a lot, I think, about in recent years.
It's an absolutely fascinating read. There's so much I could talk to you about. We could just talk about this, but I mean, the pub rock thing, I had no idea that she's in a pub rock band, really going into the back rooms, and which is an astonishing idea. This is.
I think there's a lovely little there's a 90-minute film in that, isn't there? There's a great little kind of vignette of a sort of British movie in Kate Bush's pub rock month around London. Brilliant.
Exactly. But almost the polar opposite in terms of the character that we've just spoken about is John Martyn, in that sense. You know, someone who domestic life was so complex. It's at times quite difficult to read about, you know. Was it quite difficult to write? So it's Small Hours, The Long Night of John Martyn, which is a great title. Because some of the behaviour is reprehensible, was it difficult to write about?
It was quite difficult. I mean, it was difficult, I suppose, on two levels. One, it was difficult just on a human level, because you're dealing with, as you say, some really quite serious allegations and behavior and stuff that you know, is really unpleasant, to say the least. So to kind of hear about that, and to, you know, I went into it fairly clear-eyed, knowing that John was not a saint in any stretch of the imagination. But you know, the more you speak to people and speak to family and speak to people around him, you know, I wasn't aware of the extent to kind of, you know, how serious and how prolonged and how awful a lot of his behavior was. So, I mean, there was a point where I kind of thought, do I want to write this? And then the other element of it being hard is, well, how do I write that? And how do I not shy away from that aspect of his character without, in some ways, just demolishing it, or just constantly saying on every page, this guy's awful, or being overly kind of morally policing the reader's response to it. So it took a while to sort of work out how you do that. It took a long while. It's not a very long book, but it took a long time to write, because I was kind of wrestling with that. And then I just thought, you got to put it down. You know, there's contradictions in that man that are never going to be resolved ever. It's not really my job to do that. I think that was a relief to realize I don't need to sort of solve the puzzle of John Martyn. I just need to sort of honestly tell the story of who he was and the music he made, and how, in some ways, the music is still, you know, because there's a lot of love in that music. There's a lot of beauty in that music, and it was in him that, you know, it's not inauthentic. I don't think, regardless of all the awful things he did, I still think the music is a pure expression of that person too. And so trying to tie that up was difficult. Yeah, very rewarding. I mean, I'm very proud of that book. I think it came off well, and I think, you know, you close the book thinking, I hope that you can still listen to the music of John Martyn and still appreciate it, but knowing that it came from a very deep and complicated and pretty turbulent place.
Are you surprised that John Martyn is not better known? He's never really had a big. I think, like, I'm a huge fan. I think a lot of people who are really into their music are huge fans. Perhaps discovering him through people that he influenced, I would go on to influence. But there's a lot of people, it seems, out there that really are not, sure who he is.
There are. I'm still, I'm still surprised I come across people who know their music but I've never heard of them, or have vaguely heard of them, but wouldn't be able to tell you really even one song, even May You Never, So, and I don't really know why that is. I mean, it might be that because of the way he lived his life, that it's just, it became a bit unwieldy, but I don't really see why that would be a problem in terms of kind of people knowing more about his music. His music got very messy. It's not a clean line.
Oh.
It's not Nick Drake where we can really put a box over it and say this is what he did, and it's very beautiful and very self-contained, and you can listen to the whole catalogue in a couple of hours. I don't know. It's a mystery to me. I keep thinking someone's going to use something in a big film or in a TV series, and it's going to go slightly viral because it's all there. I mean, there's stunning melodies, stunning guitar playing, incredible voice, really innovative arrangements. You can sing these songs; they're very beautiful. But as you say, it doesn't seem to have really transcended that idea of him being a musician's musician. I don't know what it would take to do that.
Nick Drake's an interesting comparison because I don't know if this is a morbid thing to say or not, but if John Martyn had passed away as a young, beautiful man, as he was as a young man, that might be a different situation. The fact he continued not just to make music, but to perform music, wheelchair bound, overweight. He was quite a different creature by the end. And you do think, go back to that idea of people, longevity sometimes can affect the way artists are thought.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I do think there was just kind of maybe too much music, and he never broke through, and he was a confusing artist in many ways because he started making, in the early 80s, making this kind of sort of Phil Collins style or Stevie Winwood, very slick kind of R&B. He stopped using the acoustic guitar because he got very bored of the limitations of it or the expectations the audience had around him, and really, right up till the end, very very sparingly went back to that style of, that incredible finger picking style that he had, that rhythmic acoustic guitar style. So that, I think that does explain it, is that he was always trying to sort of escape his past incarnations as an artist, and he was very restless. And also, I think he was genuinely terrified, I think, of being famous or being successful to that extent. I think he realized that he wouldn't have been able to handle it. I mean, to the extent where he could handle anything in real life. I think if you gave John Martyn £5 million, I think he was probably aware that that wasn't going to work for him. And I think he would have felt trapped creatively with that. So there are definitely episodes of self-sabotage all the way through his career where he's kind of deliberately not capitalizing on points where it could have been a more commercially successful. And that's just, I think that was just an intrinsic part of his nature. He was someone who was very good at throwing bombs into his own life.
And perhaps sometimes inadvertently. I mean, in the early albums, certainly the early soul albums, were really critically acclaimed. A lot of people at the time saw them for what they were, which was incredible. But then when you're moving into the 80s and your champions include Phil Collins and Eric Clapton, the kind of music press, or at least the inky music press, are not really going to warm to that, I would say.
No, and they kind of stuck with him for a while. They tried to sort of, there was some grudging praise to things like, Sapphire and these albums, which are very slick, kind of quite odd, sort of soul R&B pop records, and they tried to, because he was such a kind of, he was so loved by the music press in the 70s, partly because he was a great interviewee. He was always up for a tale and a drink, and they loved that. And he was, as you say, he was recognized in his own time. He was lauded by the press. But yeah, his desire, I think, to make money at that point, because he had gone through a divorce and he wasn't someone who put the money in the bank every week. So I think there was an element to kind of get serious in the 80s, and he looked around at people who were doing similar things and thought, I could maybe have a slice of this action. And again, that never it never worked. I don't think it wasn't calculated. You know, I think the music was always kind of from his soul in many ways, and I think he wanted to play with a band. He wanted that idea of, you know, he was a jazzer, really. He wanted that input from other people, so that it was always going to be different and always going to be stimulating on stage. I think he'd grown bored of himself probably as a musician. So I think that idea of playing with other people and having that stimulus was a very genuine one, but it just didn't fly. And as you say, yeah, he kind of lost the support of that constituency. And it was a difficult time in the 80s for guys with acoustic guitars and beards. You know, it wasn't their natural habitat. And we see a lot of his contemporaries kind of struggling and trying to find a place in that landscape where they could fit.
I seem to have this idea of the mythology of what a musician should be, the kind of troubadour, hard drinking, but then you've also got the jazz side of things, and you know, the kind of dark side of a lot of the jazz heroes that he would have had as well. Why do you think he was so obsessed almost with that hard living, hard drinking, bad boy kind of idea?
I guess that's a really good point, and I think there's a lot of strands to the answer to that. Firstly, I don't think he was ever happy with who he was or comfortable with who he was. He came from a very, you know, his parents split up when he was 2 years old, and he was sent to live with his dad and his grandmother. There was always maternal issues, that sense of kind of being abandoned by his mum, although he saw her. So I think that lies very deep in his personality, and also he was a nice middle class boy. You know, he had a big double upper flat in Tantallon Road near Queen's Park. It was a nice environment to grow up in, and I think he always felt slightly not ashamed about that, but conflicted about that. I think certainly when he started listening to the blues and probably started meeting people, you know, from other parts of Glasgow that were a bit tougher than him, he definitely aspired to that, to the gangster, to the villain, to the, you know, the street tough guy, which he wasn't by nature. You know, there's a lot of people, a lot of friends at that time say he couldn't fight his way out of a paper bag when we knew him. He was a really quite soft boy. So there's a sense always of trying to make himself tougher and make himself into the kind of man he thinks he should be. And then there's people like, you know, Hamish Imlach, who was a great mentor to him, and he really, I think he showed him the ways of the road of being a blues man, how you live as that kind of guy, which is a 24-hour party really, and you're judged on how you hold your drink and how many drugs you can take and how many women you can bed, and still be able to play a song and still be able to, you know, have a curry on the stove to feed people at 3 a.m. when they come in. That idea of being the, you know, kind of the life and soul all the time, and also being a troubadour, you know, being able just to travel around and with your guitar on your back and make music and make a living. So all those influences fed him, I think, fed into being him becoming this kind of tough guy that he wasn't really.
No. It's interesting, actually, as you see him get older, and there's some fantastic pictures in the book, he almost begins to morph into Hamish Imlach. You know, it kind of looks
If
like.
you look at him, yeah, near the end, I mean, they were very, very similar physically. But before that, he morphs into, you know, he's like a guy from an episode of Taggart who's come to collect the protection money. You know, he's got the hair slicked back and the big overcoat. And I mean, there was a lot of childishness in John Martyn. You know, a lot of that little boy never really grew up. And I think that sort of comic book idea of what it is to be a man, which is quite juvenile in a way, was a very big part of him. Yeah.
And we spoke about Kate Bush's school life, and I do wonder if John Martyn's school life kind of affected just what you've been talking about, because he went to Shawlands Academy, which was a school, a lot of middle-class area in the south side of Glasgow, Pollokshields, all those things, but also took in pupils from further afield, from perhaps harder, more a working class parts of Glasgow, and that's where he first meets folk who maybe can fight and have had to fight.
I think so. Yeah, I think that is really true. Is that real blend of kind of social classes and areas that he would have encountered at secondary school. Yeah, I think he you know, he was a great mimic as well. He was you know, you listen to him talk, he was always picking up accents, and I think that's a personality trait as well. I think he looked around him and thought, you know, these are the kind of things that I aspire to, and that would have happened pretty early, and certainly at school. Yeah.
And without getting too psychoanalytical, you mentioned his mum leaving at a young age.
Mm.
It does seem that he had to have a woman in his life, but would often treat that woman terribly. So you
Yeah.
have got that kind of real split.
Yeah, and like you, I wouldn't want to, I wouldn't want to softly psychoanalyze or in any way excuse that behavior, but he treated women appallingly regularly throughout his entire life. But it does seem to be a very ingrained mistrust and a need for constant love, but a need to reject it in the most kind of violent and physical way possible that drove those relationships. Phil Lynott was quite similar. He had a very similarly conflicted relationship with his mom and his upbringing, and certainly nowhere near as extreme as John Martyn, but I think, yeah, I would imagine that does lie somewhere in the psychology of someone who behaved like that. But hearing about that and reading about that, and also some of his one of his stepson who was really badly treated as well. Very, very hard to kind of read about that and write about it, and also not overwrite about it. There's things I left out, not because I kind of wanted to excuse him from it, but just I think there's probably a limit to what the reader needs in order to get the picture of how he behaved and what he did. I don't think you need the kind of chapter and verse on everything. Yeah. So getting that balance was always kind of tricky as well.
So with the Kate Bush book, people were willing to talk to you because it was nearly all positive. How did you find carrying out interviews for John for Small Hours? Because it's kind of the opposite of that.
Again, very people, because nobody was under any illusions really about who he was. So, his daughter, Vary, who I spoke to, was incredibly honest and clear about who he was and what he did. And also very honest and clear about how she felt about it. And that, I still loved him. He was a very loving father to me, and whatever he did, that was part of who he was. So I think that it wasn't that anyone was trying to kind of shy away from that. I think they were fascinated by him as much as anybody else. I think his family were fascinated by him, trying to work him out. And because he could be incredibly lovable and very charming and, very, very clever, very smart, very funny, obviously hugely creative, genius at some of his level, I think, of his creativity. So, I didn't really have a lot of trouble with people telling me stuff. But there was people, they were quite protective of the family going back, like his granny and stuff. Yeah. And his dad had serious alcohol problems. And there was people who were understandably not keen to sort of talk about that too much, because I guess speaking ill of the dead and all that. But I was really impressed by how honest people were and how conflicted they were. Just in that it kind of drove the book in a way. It's like, okay, people who knew him really well, saw the terrible things he did, still obviously loved him or cared for him or saw the good side in him too. And so you have, that's who he was, that's who he presented them, that's how he presented to the world. So you have to kind of try and capture that somehow.
I think that's what does capture it, because you think these people are willing to tell the stories in the way that they tell them. As you say, it's not excusing or anything, it's trying to get an understanding. And therefore, as a reader, you're getting a kind of understanding of this very complex a musician who, as you say, made some amazing music. And again, the book takes you to the music. I wasn't aware of the early work with his then wife, Beverly Martyn, which I found beautiful, some of it. It's flawed. I think you make the point that it's flawed in that it's almost two solo artists rather than a couple, but it still makes for really fantastic music.
It does. No, they were, it was a very odd pairing. And just going back to what we were talking about before, there's a sense of dread reading the book. I think as you go on through the book, you're like, what, things are going well, but something awful is going to happen quite soon. And that is actually how the kind of key to writing it clicked for me, was that reading, talking to so many people who knew him, and that idea of, well, when's it going to turn? John's in great form. He's charming everybody, but we know it's going to turn, and there's this churning sort of dread waiting for that to happen. And I thought, well, that's kind of how we need to feel when we're reading the book is that we know something awful is going to come around the corner. And when I realized that, I thought, okay, that's quite a good way of I think communicating to the reader how it felt to be around John Martyn, and probably how it felt to be John Martyn as well, because he must have known those rhythms of his own behavior, that things were going to go terribly wrong. And Beverly's a good point in that he could have had everything with her. He had a loving wife, he had a stepson, and then he had 2 more children. And they made music together and could have continued making music together. And so there was a setup for a very idyllic kind of way of living with her that encompassed domesticity and creativity and all those things. And you hear him in the songs reaching for that and wanting it, but not being able to fulfill it in real life. And there's a real sort of sense of tragedy in that, I think.
Yeah, and he often writes about relationships, past and right up to the end. They obviously clearly had an effect, the ones that had gone wrong. I used to work in bars, and it kind of reminded me you would often get characters in who were great company until they weren't. That there was and you went, okay, and that sense of dread is a really good. And I think he must have been great company until he wasn't.
Oh, he was. No, unquestionably he was. I mean, I interviewed him not that long before a few years before he died, and he was great company. Even then, he was, he was, charming and witty and very solicitous, and was worried about me getting my flight back to Scotland and all that. And but you could just see it in the eyes, like this could go. You could even then you could see it could go very badly wrong. And yeah. I think I use that analogy very early in the book. Is like, you're sitting next to some guy in a pub on the bar stool, and the lights can change from green to red very rapidly. And that was definitely John Martyn. Yeah.
We should mention that he became a bit of a kind of musical influence for a trip hop, in particular, and would then start releasing music off the back of that again, and albums. He kind of got a bit of a resurgence, maybe not the Kate Bush resurgence, but he did come to a new generation's attention.
He did, yeah. That was the sort of mid-90s, after a really sticky period, musically, of just kind of going from label to label and putting stuff out. It kind of felt like that sort of massive attack, that sort of slowed down, very stoned kind of beat, that very atmospheric mood music, definitely paid an homage to John Martyn's. I think things like Solid Air and One World, you can hear the influence that has on trip hop. So he kind of got adopted. He signed to Go Discs, and he did that cover of Glory Box by Portishead, which. Yeah. They don't like. I know that they're not big fans of that. Jeff Barrow has been disparaging about that, but I think it's a pretty decent version, actually. And
I agree.
Yeah, and so he kind of fitted for a while, and then he didn't fit again. There was no real strategy to his career by that point. It was just making albums, touring in a fairly kind of hand-to-mouth kind of way. And like we were saying before, there just never seemed to be the context where he could really grasp the opportunity to be anything more. Again, and a lot of that context in the mid-90s was musician stuff. He supported the Verve famously. I think it was 1998 in Wigan, and it was a complete disaster. He got bottled off stage because as much as the band recognized his influence, the fans really didn't. So it was hard for him at that point, I think, to find a way to kind of reinvent himself.
Before I could talk to you for so long, Graeme, we've covered 2 books, but I just wanted to, last time I spoke to you, it was about Simple Minds' Theme for Great Cities. It just been published, I think. But that's been received really well. You must be happy that this, it seems to have really struck a chord, obviously with Simple Minds fans, but I think with a wider music fan who, you mentioned to me another time, felt they almost had to defend their love of these early Simple Minds albums.
I'm so delighted with it. Yeah, it's been a really positive experience. I'm really happy with the book. The book was everything I wanted it to be, and it seems to have been received really well. As you say, from a fan base who I think we're kind of yearning for a little bit of validation, you know, like honestly, we don't have to keep explaining why we like Simple Minds. And then I think there's just quirks of timing, you know. So I think Simple Minds are just going through a really good period at the moment. People seem to be appreciating all aspects of their career. I think there has been a sense of kind of rediscovery of the early stuff, which is nice, on a wider sort of critical scale, which, you know, I wouldn't take any responsibility for, but I think it's really nice to see that happening. So it's been great. It was a joy to write. It was a joy to spend time with that music and those people, and it's been a joy just to kind of hear people talking about it and enjoying it, and digging out Empires and Dance and Sister Feelings Call, and playing them again, and realizing that there is an absolute ton of really amazing music in there.
And the book kind of ends just before they go stratospheric, really. I think kind of Don't You Forget About Me is kind of the end of, isn't it, really?
Yeah, more or less.
Would you ever think about writing about the next step, or does that not really interest you?
Not the next step. No, I mean, the impetus to do it was those early records, but also the sort of band dynamic of 5 people. And even without it being specifically Simple Minds, I was interested in how a band operates and works when everyone's feeding into it. And so that was part of that. I will write again about Simple Minds, but it won't be the next chapter in you know, the next few albums and stuff, because I don't think the dynamic of how they made music then isn't really something I'd want to write long form about. But I think the core relationship in that band, which is Jim Kerr and Charlie Burchill, is a really, really fascinating one. And so there will be more about that.
Oh, intriguing, very intriguing. And is there anyone that you would like to write about, or, you know, even maybe plan to write about, that you haven't managed to as yet?
There's always a few. I mean, you know, it's balancing again, like I was saying, that the sort of practicalities of what's feasible. I've always wanted to write about Anne Briggs, but I don't think there's probably not a big enough market for that book to make it practical to do it. I'd love to write about the Blue Nile. I'd actually love to write about. I'd love to write a really kind of all-encompassing history of Scottish music. You know, that sort of a narrative history of it, from right sort of back from the 50s up till now, and to kind of draw some connections there. Again, it's something that maybe doesn't have, or isn't perceived to have, the kind of commercial potential that it would take to put the hours in to do that. But I would like to do that at some point. There might be another way of doing that. That's a different means of writing about it. So yeah, there's always people. I'd love to write with Van Morrison, you know, in terms of his more kind of involved music, you know, his more kind of transcendent music. I think that's stuff I'd really love to write about. I think I'm getting more interested in writing about the music and the effect of music than sort of straight biography, or like the Kate Bush book. I don't think I'd write a book like that now, that really kind of full life biography. It's really hard. It's really hard work. And I feel like, yeah, maybe the music comes more and more to the fore now, of trying to explain how it feels to listen to music. And so yeah, there's always a few on my wish list.
Yeah. When I first picked up Under the Ivy, there's a quote on the cover from Paddy McAloon, and I was thinking, I'd love to read Graeme's book on Paddy McAloon. That's a character I think that people would like to know more about, but maybe that's just music fans of my age and your age that would do that. I don't know. That's
very kind. A few people have mentioned that, which is very kind. And my standard response is, I would love to read his book about himself. I'd love to read a memoir by Paddy about his life and his creative life. He's a lovely guy. You know, I don't know him very well, but he's a really nice person, and he's also an amazing songwriter. And it's a shame we don't hear more of his output, but you know, I know he is still very creative, and I think he could write a wonderful book about all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Graeme, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I really enjoyed that.
Me too, Ali. Thanks so much.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.